share the screen again. All right, so activity-based costing. So now we're moving away a little bit from just how to track total costs and allocate them between work in process and finished goods and so on, to a more refined question of what is the best way to allocate overhead, right? And if you think about it, go back in your job order costing discussion. How do we allocate overhead? What was a two-step process? In the beginning of the year, you basically budgeted a certain amount of overhead, right? Said, okay, I estimate that I'll spend $5 million on the overhead, right? Remember that? And then you budgeted a certain number of units produced, or not units produced. You budgeted a driver, right? Whether it's labor hours, whatever drives overhead, whatever increases, whatever you decided contributes to an increase in overhead, whatever the cause of it, right? Whether it's labor hours, whether it's square feet, whether it's a number of setups. But the point of it was one thing, right? And you let's say, okay, it's maybe I'll just allocate the overhead on we called it an overhead allocation base. And okay, $5 million of overhead. I'm going to estimate I'm going to have 100,000 labor hours, and I'm going to say I'm going to allocate 5 million divided by 100,000. It's going to be $50 per labor hour, right? And if a job incurs 100 labor hours, it will be 50 times 100, $5,000 of overhead will be allocated to that, right? Remember that. That's basically, we had a budgeted allocation rate, and then they simply applied it on base of whatever the driver we decided. What is the problem with this approach, at least on the conceptual level, is that overhead is never driven by one thing, right? It's never really driven by one thing, by one activity, right? Because overhead is kind of a mishmash of different things. It could be setting up machines, it could be supervisor's salary, it could be depreciation, the cost of equipment, right? All, like overhead is a combination of many different things. Think about what at the University of Baltimore, what represents overhead. Anybody could tell me, like, what's overhead for us? What are the different overhead costs? The cost of the president's salary, of the dean's salary, of the library, or right? All of those things are overhead costs. And suppose, and I don't know how we allocate overhead here, but suppose for a minute we allocate overhead using full-time credit hours equivalents, right? We just take all of this, say, okay, we budget that the university will generate throughout the year 1 million credit hours. And then we, based on the actual credit hours generated by each respective academic unit, which is the business school, the law school, and the business school, because law school doesn't do it. They track the cost separately, but business school, college and CAS, right? We'll just say, okay, business school generated $500,000, that they get to eat half of it. That's basically kind of, I don't know if this is for the fact, but that's the way it would work, right? Now, you could imagine that what we're assuming essentially all of those costs, which we said Kelly just illustrated for us, are all very different, but they're all somehow directly driven by the number of credit hours, right? And it doesn't take a PhD in accounting to realize that this is, a very, very imprecise assumption, let's just say, right? Because you pay president the salary and the security guard salary, irrespective of how many students necessarily you've got. That would be one example, right? You need to run electricity for the building throughout the whole day. Doesn't matter if the building is full versus not, right? So you basically pretend all the costs are variable, which they're not. So what activity cost-based costing does, it says, okay, well, rather than to assume that everything is driven by a single cost driver, in this my example, full-time equivalent credit hours, every piece of overhead that's, let's say, whether it's security guards. Security guards costs are driven by, I don't know, number of buildings or the square footage used. Whereas maybe the, I don't know, electricity is driven by number of classrooms in every building, right? So they all have kind of different origins, right? So let's track overhead or different parts of overhead using these different drivers. And what that allows to do is then you're more precisely, depending on how much of that every extra driver every cost unit consumes, allows us to more precisely estimate those costs. Does that make sense? So if you read the slides, what does it say? It says activity-based costing is a costing method assign cost to products, services, or activities based on the resources they consume, aka cost driver. It's more refined and accurate approach to cost allocation compared to traditional costing methods, such as job order costing and process costing, which often rely on arbitrary allocation methods like labor hours and machine hours. ABC focuses on identifying and analyzing various activities, both direct and indirect, that go into producing a product or delivering a service. These activities include setup, inspection, material handling, and more, right? Now, this is very manufacturing focused. Doesn't have to be, right? Because in a service organization, you won't necessarily have any machines. But whatever is the driver, right? Whatever is the driver of an activity. It might be the number of customers. It might be the number of setups. It might be the number of students. It might be the number of buildings, what have you. But the idea is that you want to figure out, okay, I have this different costs. They're all collectively called overhead, but they're all not the same. We don't want to just make them all the same, because making them the same is wrong. Because every type of cost is driven and consumed by a different type of driver. So instead of allocating costs based on a single broad cost driver like labor hours or machine hours, ABC identifies multiple cost drivers related to specific activities. Cost drivers are factors that cause costs to vary, such as number of setups, number of inspections, of all the materials used. Okay, I'm kind of repeating myself here. Now, and then what you do is you track them separately through every piece of this overhead, driven by different driver. You track them different from different cost pools. And I'll show you a very simple example of how it's done, right? It's all very common sense. Okay. Figure out whatever. All right. So next slide. So why this is suddenly this idea? It was what it's no. On paper, this sounds great, right? It sounds great because, okay, well, very common sense. But yet, as I will tell you, it hasn't taken as broad of a hold. It was popularized initially in 1980s, and it's every single management cost management accounting. Well, not every single one. Zimmerman actually doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but very many traditional cost accounting, management accounting textbooks talk about it as if it's some sort of word of, like from higher authority. This is like, but in reality, as we've discovered fairly early on, companies might use it to some degree, but don't use it very much. Why is that? So on at least in theory, it's a very useful approach, because traditional costing methods often lead to cost distortion, where some products or services are cross-subsidized by others. What does that mean? When you use one driver, like we talked about earlier, if you consume a lot of that, remember, it's basically averaging everybody based on this driver, right? Whether you consume a lot of it or not. So inevitably, some part of the business will use a lot of, will consume a lot of that, whatever, labor hours, etc. Some won't. But since you're averaging it all across all costs, everybody gets to be assigned the same amount. So whether I use a lot of it or not. So it's the same thing. Like, for example, if let's say, suppose some academic units here don't have any security guards. Maybe they just use an automatic key card system where everybody cannot even get in, and there is no security guards. Well, if you under the kind of the traditional method allocate an overhead, it doesn't matter whether you have it or not, so long as you use, if we allocate it using, student hours, everybody uses student hours, so you'll get to eat some of that cost. Well, if I don't, but I don't use it, why should I eat it? Well, that's the way this method works. Under the ABC, though, if you're not using, any of the security guards and you're not consuming any of the driver of that cost, you would not be assigned any, and only those units that use that would be assigned. So let me check. All right, so it's great, right? The theory that makes it more fair, it makes it, more clean. But while ABC has significant benefits, it can be more complex and resource intensive to implement compared to traditional costing methods. It requires careful data collection, analysis, and ongoing maintenance of cost drivers and activity cost pools. Practically speaking, what this means is that, remember, like when we started, we talked about this notion of economic Darwinism, I think in the first class. It's whether the cost of collecting this extra information is justified by the benefits. And what most companies found out over time, that this is just not the case with ABC. It's easier and cheaper, even though it's probably less correct, to just use the averaging costing systems like using one, maybe two drivers, rather than to go and trace all those different drivers and know what drives what, and it requires lots of analysis and lots of cost tracking. And most companies just decided until recently that it's just not worth it. It's not worth it. Now, I posted an article, I believe, or I intended to post, let me see if I did or not, that kind of discusses that. And it's from Strategic Finance Magazine, which is the journal of International of Institute of Management Accountants. And I didn't post it. Oh, it is right there. It's the standard costing versus ABC. Right, so take a look at it. I will share the screen with you. Right, it's posted. Standard costing and ABC and coexistence. Actually, kind of a nice article, and you don't read it like line by line, but basically it talks about, if ABC is so great on paper, why nobody uses, or so many fewer people use it than we would expect. And the main reason is it's too costly to track all the data on its cost drivers and accumulate its cost drivers to make it worth it. But now with AI and all of that, with data analytics making all these leaps and bounds, theoretically, at least, it will become cheaper to keep track cost of activities and all of that. So we may actually yet see the resurgence of ABC. It might actually come back and get its second wind, if you will. All right, so benefits of ABC. ABC is most beneficial to companies with complex overhead structures, right? When you have lots of potential drivers, and when averaging overhead cost using one driver is just not a good, will result in distortions. Companies use ABC to determine, at least theoretically, companies use ABC to determine profitability of individual products or product lines. When do you want to use it? Is because when this cost distortions that you may produce from essentially just averaging everything out could really lead you to wrong decisions. And I'll give you an example of one such situation that's described in the Wall Street Journal article that I came across. The information helps them make informed decisions about pricing, product mix, and resource allocation. Companies with diverse and complex product lines benefit from it, as it helps them understand which products are more cost sensitive to produce, intensive to produce, which ones are most profitable. All right, so it's kind of easy thing to do. You just, you need to figure out what the average cost per unit of driver is, and you allocate on that basis. The reading that I gave you on the cost reserve talks about, there was an attempt made because it was pretty early on understood that it's, too complex to keep track of all cost drivers and so on. So they said, okay, to simplify that, rather than to look for drivers, just let's look for time it takes to use every, part of overhead. And they called it time-driven activity-based costing, which is a variation of traditional ABC that simplifies the process of assigning cost to activities and products or services. It was developed as a more practical and efficient approach to cost allocation. And under this TDABC, time is the primary cost driver. So everything is just cost per unit of time rather than cost per setup or cost per machine hour. So, where it works well probably is when, where it's more precise, when you can actually easily track time for certain activities, right? Like I was talking about, how much time does the dean spend on, MBA versus undergrad, right? Well, we can maybe easily or hard, more easily figure that out. I know. So if it's worth it to track it, that was the idea, right? So that's rather than to look for multiple drivers, kind of gives you one driver sort of time. But time drives everything. But they also didn't stick very well, as it turns out. All right. So rather than to have a cost per unit of the driver used, it becomes cost per unit of time required to perform an activity. All right. So this is from an academic article quote. I posted the article. You don't need to read it if you don't want to, but just read the quote. The article was published in 2006. So it's called The Review of Activity-Based Costing Technique, Implementation, and Consequences from Handbook of Management Accounting Research. In 2005, the ABC paradox remained unexplained. What is the paradox? The paradox is such a good idea on paper. Why is it not being used? That's the paradox. ABC has several interesting features from a conceptual point of view. It is very attractive to a manager since it can provide relevant information for decision making. Nobody argues with that. ABC has been included in most, if not all, management accounting textbooks. It's also part of the curriculum of most business schools and professional accounting associations. The ABC paradox remains because even though ABC seems to be well known and accepted in management accounting collectivity, it has not been considered, and a majority of organizations has been abandoned by many organizations sometime in the 90s decided to adopt and implement. Okay. All right. So at least until recently, this was thought of as a great idea that doesn't work in practice. So here's the article that I came across a couple of years ago in Wall Street Journal, and I read Wall Street Journal, so you should know, religiously every week. I read every issue of it. I don't read them every day. I read them all on a Saturday, but all the 5 or 6 issues for the week. And I came across this article. It says, what does knee surgery actually cost? And that's a problem. Okay. So I'm going to next pull up the article because it's worth reading, actually, kind of reading it through, right? This is you want to know what the surgery costs, right? Wouldn't you think? If you're a hospital. Well, certainly if you're a patient, you would want to know because, that affects how much you have to pay for it, right?
Yeah, Professor, there's one of those hospital shows, and it shows about somebody got shot, and it tracked the whole episode was how much it cost every time they operated in a nerve. It was like $230,000. It was crazy how much it cost.
Well, let's see. Let's read the article. You may be surprised. I mean, I don't know how much somebody getting shot costs, but read the article. So the price we pay for healthcare often has little connection to what it actually costs. Surprise, surprise. That's why United States healthcare is so expensive. One hospital decided to investigate. For nearly a decade, Gunderson Health System Hospital in La Crosse, Wisconsin, boosted the price of knee replacement surgery an average of 3% a year. Isn't that nice, right? Because they're basically a monopolist. They can increase costs just as much as they want, right? It's sort of what colleges do by raising tuition. That's why we're in the situation we're in today. By 2016, the average list price was more than $50,000, including surgeon and anesthesiologist. Well, on one hand, you could think 50,000 is not that bad. Knee surgeries are pretty complicated, right? And they can have very serious consequences if done improperly. So maybe 50,000 is not so bad. And even as administrators raised the price, they had no real idea what it would cost to perform the surgery, the most common for hospitals in the US outside those related to childbirth. Well, you would think about it, it's not so unique. You should have a better idea, right? It's not that complicated. Many people develop knee problems as you age. They set the price using a combination of educated guesswork and canny assessment of market opportunity. What's the term for market? It's I'll raise the price when I can, right? Prompted by rumblings from Medicare, surprise, surprise, because the government is the biggest payer here, right? Because who gets knee surgeries? Mainly older people that are on Medicare, and the government just doesn't want to be on the hook over that. and private insurers or potential changes to payments, Gunderson decided to nail down the numbers. So here they actually went through this consulting process like that I kind of made fun of a little bit in my first class, but sometimes it's warranted. During the 18-month review, an efficiency expert trailed doctors and nurses, like remember I gave you an example with a notepad. This is something like, I presume it wasn't the notepad, but a computer, to record every minute of activity and note instruments, resources, and medicine used. The hospital tallied the nighttime nurses spent wheeling around CCR cards, a mismatch of available post-surgery beds, unnecessarily costly bone cement, and delays dispatching physical therapists. The actual cost, $10,500, including the physicians. The list price was 5 times that amount. Isn't that shocking? So you can read the rest of the articles. I mean, I don't want to, let's see if there's anything else in here. Now, in this particular case, I think the punchline is here. Hospitals can be shielded from competition that forces other industries to rein out expenses and slash prices, right? If you're a monopolist, if you're the only hospital in that town, then I bet it's probably made up mainly of a lot of retirees because it's rural, right? Who lives in a rural area, a lot of people are older. Hospital list prices are a starting point of negotiations with insurance companies, what they actually pay, and those deals are confidential. Now, why is that important? Why is it important that this is confidential stuff leads to this sort of distortion? Because if prices are private, if you don't really know, then nobody can really know. Prices need to be public for people to be for competition to ensue, right? Because, right? If you don't know what somebody else charges you, you can't come up with a better price, right? So that's a very convenient thing for you. Consolidation has given hospitals greater pricing power in many markets, according to health economics researchers. So if you're a de facto monopolist, you don't need to think about costs. And your prices are confidential. How's that great? Nobody knows what I charge. I don't even need to worry about what is the relationship between the cost of what I do and how much I charge. Nice life. And so the bottom line is being cost effective was not an imperative in that type of market dynamic. On the knee replacement surgery, higher cost hospitals spent almost twice the amount of lower cost hospitals spent, despite largely similar quality and roughly comparable patients. Now, what do we learn from this article? We learned several things, actually. That's why I liked it, and that's why I kept it, and I wanted to share it. We learned a lot about the role of competition in pricing, right? That's not really subject of this class, but it has a very direct relationship to why cost accounting is important. Because if I'm a monopolist, right, and I have very high pricing power, meaning I can no one's there out there, and I have a lot of bargaining power between supplier as a supplier, right, and I'm a price maker versus price taker, then I don't have to worry about costs too much. I can charge 5 times the cost if I wanted to. Nor do I need to be very precise about tracking this cost, because I'll make my money anyway. You know, it was very funny. I had a contractor do my bathroom a couple of years ago, and he was a guy that liked to talk, like one of those. And he said, "You know what? Like, if you didn't go into contracting business, that I should have run a security system company." I said, "Why?" You know, a security system company is basically, until recently, you don't have to do much. You just get to charge and you just sit there. Like most of the time, nothing happens. And absent competition, people would pay you $50 a month. It was a great gig until Amazon showed up with their insecurity and made it. What did Amazon make it? Pay $100 a year for it. Versus $600 a year, they have to pay ADT. Now, as the markets become more competitive, you suddenly start worrying about what? Your costs. And whereas maybe until now, ABC wasn't that relevant to me, because who cares? I can charge 500% profit margin. So it doesn't really matter. It's all margin of error. Who cares what how I track costs, what are the drivers of costs, whatever. Costs are not that relevant, how they're allocated. Suddenly, as the markets become more competitive, right, my margins start what? What happens with them? Start shrinking, and I need to worry about costs. And I need to worry about precisely tracking those costs. This morning, actually, it's very funny. I have a friend who teaches at another major institution on the East Coast, major university. So every like once a year, maybe twice a year, we talk on the phone. So I said, how are things going at your institution? He said, oh, it's great. We got a new dean. He really, got our financial affairs in order. I said, how did they do that? You know what? And then the next line was really shocking to me. He said, for the first time, and this is interesting, this dean for the first time started publishing actually profit and loss statements by program in our college. And you know what? Once they started doing that, they realized that some of the master's program they had were money losers, and they just shut them down. And once they shut them down, we're making money again. And you think about it's absurd, right? On a certain level, it's absurd, right? But it happens, right? You think about really, you don't what? So, Abe, my point here, I think the point of the article, the point of the story of this conversation, it's kind of funny that by accident I had it like several hours before this class. Precise tracking of costs becomes much more important as your margins shrink, as you develop financial problems, and as you're pressured, most importantly, to use your resources more efficiently, right? So, yes, ABC has kind of not been very popular. And again, it hasn't been very popular because companies found that it just wasn't worth the effort. But a lot of it was also probably driven by what? The fact that in America, we also have, by many arguments, our markets are not super competitive. If you look at the cost of average American family's phone, like I have Verizon, I can tell you. So why is that? Well, there was a finance professor, Daniel Bergstresser, I think it was him, who wrote a book about basically over the last 20 or so years, our economy became much less competitive than it ever was. We essentially allowed certain industries to concentrate unduly. That took away. Think about like the whole cell phone industry. What is it? Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile. We only have 3 players in the whole industry. They can charge whatever the hell they want.
Right, it used to be 4, and those 2 merged recently, but I'm surprised they allowed that to go through, but they did.
Yeah, well, because we've been very liberal in this country with allowing mergers, and that basically, okay, well, you can charge whatever you want. Like I bet, like it's actually like I was kind of shocked. But for a long time, I thought, if you look at Africa, so many people have cell phones, and Africa is not rich. I bet they don't pay $250 a month in Africa for a cell phone service because it might be monthly salary for most people there in many places. And so, how come is that in America we pay so much? Because they can charge us that. That's the only answer. That's the answer. Now, if you are living in this environment where guess what, people will pay whatever you tell them, then they don't need to worry about ABC. ABC doesn't make any sense because why? It's not worth the effort. But if we can move to a more competitive environment, then it becomes more important. As you start losing money, it becomes more important because you really need to understand where your costs are, right? Like this friend's example, he told me, look, very simple. We just started tracking our costs by program, right? And it's in a way kind of like crude ABC, right? Because different programs use different activities. They consume different levels of resources. And we realized that, look, if we just got rid of this tool, we would just be fine, right? Suddenly. The other thing that I think is happening is now the cost of actually generating data is going down, right? Because, now with all kinds of sensors that we've got, all kind of like, machine learning, all these other things, big data, it's much easier to the cost of computing power has come down quite a bit. So it might, companies might say, okay, well, now it's so cheap anyway, why not do it, right? Because they'll start looking for efficiencies. Okay, so this is kind of a broad philosophical discussion on ABC.